Here we go, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 7. Last video. This is book presentation number 9. We're talking a little bit more about intrinsic motivation, but how intrinsic motivation lends itself to or facilitates concepts called flow and being clutch and in the moment. Now, 151, the book begins a conversation regarding achieving flow state, and it spills over into page 152. And they cite research by this gentleman here, who's his name's Csikszentmihalyi. And I won't ask you to spell that on a quiz or a test anywhere, don't worry, but in case you want to know how to phonetically say his name, that's how you say it. And his research investigated what it takes, I mean, quite honestly at its root, what it takes to have a task become intrinsically motivating. And what he found was it lends itself to really a conversation of when you become intrinsically motivated, you actually start to progress towards being more in flow within the activity itself. So you look at this, and it has to be a balance of changing skills. You have to be completely absorbed in the activity, clear goals regarding what you're trying to accomplish, merging of action and awareness. You have to be in the moment, total concentration on the task at hand. You kind of have a little bit of loss of self-consciousness. You're there, but you're not really fully aware. You have a sense of control, like omni-control and everything in that point. Even though you have a little bit of loss of self-consciousness, you have this kind of like feeling of being completely in control of your environment and everything you touch. It's within your grasp. It's in your control. There are really no extrinsic motivators. There's really no reward that's perceived with this concept. Time kind of morphs, and for some people it slows down, for some people it speeds up. And it becomes effortless in what you do. You don't even think about your movement anymore. And you end up having this kind of like heightened or augmented hearing and vision. And I've said it before in one of our other presentations, you get to the point when you work with an athlete and you teach a skill enough, they no longer think about it as an athlete, they just do as an athlete, because a thinking athlete is a slow athlete. And at first, part of the learning curve when you work with athletes, and part of the performance curve, to be quite honest, is the simple fact that when you teach an athlete ABC drills for sprint technique, and they've never been asked to perform those drills, what you're doing is you're taking that very complex movement of sprinting and breaking it down into subcomponents, and you're asking your athletes to think about each subcomponent. They've never done that. And so as a result, they have to go through the learning curve to be able to think through each process incrementally, think through the running and sprint process when you actually have them apply those skills to sprinting. And then eventually there's less thinking and more doing, and they become more proficient. That's on a very, very early stage of a much larger continuum that takes you to something like this when we talk about flow, where they're not thinking at all about sprinting. They're just doing, but because you've taught them all these great basic rudimentary skills on how to run faster, their bodies just naturally fall right into doing that. And in the context of a highly competitive environment, their movement becomes effortless. The challenges that are there are really not challenges to them anymore, or not as daunting to them anymore. And it becomes this kind of balance where they no longer have to allocate, if you will, bandwidth to think about how to move. They can just act and react, and they have such great awareness that they don't have to think anymore. I digress. Within flow state, you have intrinsic motivation is at its highest, right? And it's at the point where it is at its highest that you'll have maximum performance is achieved. And it requires a couple of things. I remember coaching a youth football team, and we had this game where we weren't blowing the opponent out, and we were pretty evenly matched at halftime, and we went into halftime break. I'm like, guys, this is exactly what you want as an athlete. You want a comparable opponent who can challenge you, and challenge you in a way where it'll help you grow and develop your skill set. The other 3 teams that we played so far this year, at the time we were 3-0, and this was our 4th game. The other 3 teams that we've played, we blew them out. I'm like, guys, that really wasn't a challenge. It didn't really allow you the opportunity to apply what we've done. But this opponent, this is great. This is exactly what you want as an athlete, 100%. And so there's a component there where you have to have the task and the ability have to be pretty evenly matched, right? You have to be within the ballpark. The challenge needs to be, relatively speaking, high for the person. It can't be like you have a youth football player going against somebody in the NFL, but it should be, relatively speaking, a challenge. And the ability that you have to bring to the table has to match the ability of your opponent. And when you get to that just right place where it's the task is right, your opponent is right, your skill level is proper, you're well prepared, they're well prepared, and everything aligns up, you end up having this kind of like sweet spot where you're not freaked out about facing a much better opponent, so your anxiety isn't through the roof. And the other side of it is you're not playing a team that is not prepared at all. You're playing a well-prepared team, and so you're not bored. So really, when you hit the sweet spot and it's just right, your anxiety's low, you're fully engaged, you're in the moment, you have high intrinsic motivation, and your performance as a result will end up being at its highest level. And then what happens? It becomes a point of reference, sidebar. Its point of reference becomes, look at that evenly matched team that we played. Look how well you did, and look at all the things you learned, and look how to apply your skills. Now this next team we're playing in week number 6, a couple weeks out, they're actually a better team than the one we just played. So we'll need to start to refine our skills a little bit more. And you can start to play that game with your athletes in terms of cultivating and building upon skills and evolving skill sets from game to game to game and practice to practice to practice. I said it before, you're talking about day to day and play to play. Sometimes it's as simple as just refining something from play to play. So you try to have this balance, and I like this graph in the, or this figure, excuse me if I can say it correctly, this figure that they have in the book. If you have the right challenge and you have the right skills, you'll get yourself into flow a lot easier. If your skills are low but the challenge is high, you'll have a high anxiety environment. Conversely, if the challenge is low but you have high skills, you're going to have boredom. And then if you have, frankly, low skills and there's low challenge, it's just a bunch of athletes kind of running around on a field without purpose, it's apathetic. There's really no engagement, no involvement. So I really like this on page 154 to kind of encapsulate this whole concept of what it takes to be in flow. It's the right challenge and the right skills. And even within that context, you might be in a competitive environment where the teams might not be evenly matched, but you might have your point guards are evenly matched between the two programs, and it becomes just a showcase between their two talents as opposed to the talents of the two teams. So it can also be two participants, two competitors on the field will have an opportunity to go into flow. So flow and peak performance are at times used interchangeably. They're close, don't get me wrong, but peak performance is a little bit different in that peak performance depends upon an objective performance outcome or objective performance measure. Whereas flow, you're kind of in the moment, it's more process oriented, whereas peak performance ends up being more outcome oriented. So again, you're kind of hearing this theme regarding being process oriented and outcome oriented. Just keep in mind flow, you're kind of in flow, you're in the process of flow. Peak performance, peak connotates or denotes you're going up to a peak and then coming back down to a singular point. So it's very outcome oriented, whereas flow is you're in the moment, you're kind of in flow from moment to moment. Let me move this over here. The book lists different overlapped kind of flow states between emotional, mental, physical, these different elements that kind of help you in this process. And I like these, don't get me wrong, and I put these in here for purpose because you look at this, you have no negative emotions, there's no negative self-talk, very calm, emotional control, there's enjoyment in the process, synergy with teammates. Sounds very much like some of the stuff we've talked about in terms of being process oriented and really having an environment that's been created by the coach to allow the right emotional state for flow to happen, or even peak performance. Peak performance. Okay. And then on the mental side, with mental elements, you have good preparation. You got to be in the moment. You can only control what you control. You're confident in your ability to be able to perform a skill. Boy, that sounds familiar to something we talked about in the last presentation. And it ends up being more task-related focus as opposed to outcome-related focus. Physical elements, automatic movement, precision of technique, effortlessness, dominance, speed of game, slowing down. I agree with all these, especially as a coach, where you can teach your athletes to be able to move more efficiently. And like I mentioned, running technique a couple slides ago, you're talking about how you can have your athletes get completely blown out of the water when you ask them to think about something they've never thought about in their lives. But then through systematic teaching and reinforcement and refining movement patterns, they don't think anymore, they just do, and they're no longer a thinking athlete, they're just a doing athlete, and it becomes automatic to them. That's what you want. That's the sweet spot. And you just work on refining technique until it becomes effortless. And I can tell you what ends up happening when you're in that state. It allows the speed of the game to slow down. You don't have that stressor on you anymore. And it really allows you to see the field, and you have this kind of heightened sense of awareness. And then from the sensory side, you feel very in tune with your body, where you are in space. Again, the game kind of slows down, and it's a little bit because of improved vision, but it's also because the actual speed of the game slows down relative to the participant. Excuse me. So based upon the chapter, we're seeing that being in a state of flow has kind of numerous factors, inclusive, in situation, competition, if the situation, the competition, the course of task, and the ability. It also has kind of an intrinsic component that includes the control of one's thoughts and emotions, and maintaining an appropriate level of activation and relaxation. So there's kind of a sweet spot in here. And they talk about this study. And in the study, what they found was that it was related to performance, of course, but the psychological skills that athletes would use in terms of being calm, having emotions in check, maintaining the right amount of activation, etc. These are the things that allow you to kind of stay in this almost not homeostasis, but in this nice sweet spot of a mental space to be able to function as an athlete. And I like this a lot in terms of it comes down to preparation, task focus, coping strategies, goal setting, motivational exercises, confidence building, and arousal manipulation. And think about this from a coaching standpoint. Well, you can work on preparation. You can help them focus on task. You can give them coping strategies, goal setting, motivational exercises, confidence building, and arousal manipulation. So as a coach, it's not just a physical run up and down the basketball court, but you can offer these types of skill sets to help heighten their physiological response. So psychological, physiological, as we've seen, are very tied. So being clutch is different than flow. It's kind of a sudden process, very task dependent, like you want to shoot a free throw. The athletes kind of use these terms to describe characteristics of being clutch or in flow. And what it comes down to is kind of like being mindful and aware of the environment. But when you're in a clutch state, there's overlap between these lists, and the characteristics they talk about are absence of negative thoughts, intense effort, heightened arousal. These are very much things that in some regard are intrinsic motivators, and you look at ways to bring back or peel back people who have high anxiety and negative self-talk. I mean, you're talking about ways to manage that in terms of their negative self-speak and negative thoughts. So as a coach, that's a skill that you have to bring to the table. So being mindful and self-aware can help the athlete also self-regulate. They talk about having a disassociative versus associative strategies. Disassociated, you're kind of focusing away from the task, and associative, you're kind of focusing on the task, but you're using positive reinforcement and positive motivating self-talk, and you're kind of talking yourself through the process to allow it to happen, where in clutch situations it just happens. So to that end, you look for a little bit of mindfulness. So factors that prevent or disrupt flow, I urge you to take a look at these, kind of read through. This is on 156. This is on 157, if I remember correctly, or this is all on 156. I'm trying to remember. But take a look at these in terms of what's preventative and what's disruptive. And to that end, guys, thank you so much. Signing off.